We are live, Mitchell.
Hey, friends.
Welcome, everyone.
Really glad you're here on the day after Sunday podcast, watching us on Facebook Live or YouTube, wherever we're streaming at. Where are we
I'm
streaming?
not. We're streaming it both. I'm not actually sure anybody has ever joined us on a Monday morning on YouTube.
That's all right.
So if you're out there and you want to join us on YouTube, you should right now.
Yeah, definitely. We started a brand new worship series too, entitled "The Encountering the Risen Christ." And we were thinking about how do we take these stories that we hear about Jesus showing up in the disciples' midst, and then how does that like actually affect, inspire us to see where the risen Christ is in our world today? And so this series is really based in the Gospel of John, which is really different than the Gospel of Mark. Phil, I don't know if you knew that.
Uh, I mean, you were kind of in and out of Bible study last week, but I basically went on a whole riff of how different the Gospel of John is versus the Gospel of Mark, and what that means for us, and what the theological backing is behind all of that. And there were some good questions about like, well, if they're this different, like, should that make us question the legitimacy of one gospel over the other? And these are things we talk about in Bible study because sometimes I get real nerdy.
Right, totally. And so we'll be in the Gospel of John for the next 3 weeks. And this past Sunday, we were looking at the resurrection account, essentially, in the Gospel of John. And I want to start with this. My good friend, Jack Soper,
Oh yeah,
retired United Methodist minister, who I had the pleasure of serving on Board of Ordained Ministry with for like exactly 1 month. And before he said, I'm done. He served on it for a long time. His go-to question for ordinands and folks getting commissioned was this: where is the risen Christ today? How would you answer that question, Phil? Where is the risen Christ today?
right here.
Yeah, right? He would say within us, right?
Sure.
And I love this idea that the risen Christ is an active, ongoing reality for us, not just something we read about or celebrate on Easter, but this ongoing presence of God in the world. And so I think that's like what's at the heart of this worship series for the next 2 weeks now.
Yeah, totally. I think this is hard, especially for people who really struggle with this idea of resurrection and what does this mean? Is it bodily? Is it not? Like when we say Christ is risen, God lives, like all these things, like what does it mean for God to be alive? What is it like? I think Jack's question is a really poignant one that a lot of people wrestle with, like logically, and so it's taken me, at least a decade, if not more, to come to grips with what this means theologically for myself, and almost like in the realm of pushing me in a kind of a more mystical space in my understanding of what this means. But then practically, what does it mean as well? And I think that's what this series we'll dabble a little bit with both of those, kind of the mystical aspect, but also the practicality points of it. Like, what does this really mean to encounter the risen Christ, and what do these experiences look like for us?
Yeah. And we're kind of anchoring not only this series, but also the next worship series, which we're excited about as well, on this idea of spiritual experiences, right?
Yep.
And so I was thinking about that as I was writing the sermon, and like, what does it mean then for like, what do we do in worship, right? Like, what are we trying to cultivate? Is it, I tried to kind of get there in my sermon saying like, what we do in worship is not to convince you of anything, right? Like that's not the space or the medium. I don't think that that's like what good preaching is. It's me trying to convince you to believe what I believe,
right?
Or I've come to believe, but rather to question and wrestle with Scripture and the world in such a way that something new is revealed to us, right? And I think that that's just a very different approach when we look at preaching like across America. I think there are a lot of people that think preaching is a place for a place to try to convince people to essentially believe right doctrine or
there
doctrine.
you go. Right. Believe, have the right thought, like have the right understanding. It's just almost, it's become, I hate to say it this way. Sometimes it's become just the transfer of information. Right. And that's pretty boring. Like
Yeah,
I can,
regardless of how engaging it is, the output still remains a very low bar, right?
right. And, you and I talked about this last week or week before or something, that one of the things that was so compelling about Rob Bell when he first started was that like he took this idea of preaching and said, this is an art, and he wanted to kind of reclaim the art of preaching in a way that was way more than just the communication of information, right? And like when I first heard Rob Bell, it was almost like the preachers I was hearing then were like reading an encyclopedia versus like somebody who was doing a dramatic interpretation of some play or something. Like there was just night and day difference of what was taking place and how it was presented, and then what my like bodily and spiritual response was in based on those two different portrayals.
Yeah, it's good.
And that's challenging as a preacher then, right? Like, did you take a class on preaching that talked about? Well, I never took a class on preaching, which we have a whole story about. We could talk about at some point, but I mean, I don't know what that was conveyed like in a preaching class in seminary. Like,
not it. No, I think preaching in general is it's so subjective anyway. What good preaching is, right?
Sure, totally.
And I know that like there would be those that say like, no, Mitchell's preaching is not that good, or there would be others who be like, I really, really, really like Mitchell's preaching, right? So I think it's hard to gauge what good preaching is, but you kind of know it when you see it, and more importantly, but no, to answer the question, no, I didn't have a particularly robust preaching class. I had one, I took one, but it was not a good class in seminary. And I kind of grieve that. I didn't get to take a preaching class with like a titan of the, preaching world. But that just wasn't really part of ILIF's overall educational, goals. So I think when you're looking at preaching, the most important thing is, I think, that the preaching be as authentic as possible, right? And if there is a whiff of inauthenticity in what is happening, then I think that the thing breaks down. There will be people who can preach to really large audiences and would fail to be able to connect with an intimate space. And there are people who can preach really well off a manuscript. Nadia Bolz-Weber comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
Or there are those whose best preaching happens when they don't have anything in front of them, right? And so I think like it's just about finding what works for the preacher, because ultimately, if we're trying to get to that place where worship is a place where we're trying to cultivate these kind of experiences with the text and with one another and within community, then the job of preaching, I think, is not to just transfer information, but to pay attention to the community and ask good questions and wrestle with scripture in such a way that we might have something revealed to us in that space, because that's what we're longing for, these like really deep spiritual experiences,
right?
Because we often don't find them in the mundane. It doesn't mean that they don't exist there. In fact, there's something very sacred about the ordinary, but we're not attuned or trained to pay attention to it in that way.
You said Nadia, and I think I heard this first from Nadia, was the idea that the role of the preachers to be the midwife of the gospel. Right, like it's not your responsibility to write the gospel, the good news, right? But you're the midwife that like creates a space for it to enter into the world.
Yeah, and I think that requires, it requires time, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the birthing of the gospel, week in and week out, just like any birth, it doesn't just happen. right? Like
Yep.
there's a whole lot of steps, especially in modern medicine, that we take to like get us there. And then there's what happens after the birth too. And so I think like if you take that very, kind of feminine divinity aspect of what's happening, right? You really, I don't know, you really have to spend a lot of time with the text. You really have to spend a lot of time crafting a sermon, and you really have to spend a lot of time learning your congregation and those things that are necessary for preaching. I think
that's all you do, right? You just sit around all week long and just write sermons, right?
Yep, that's it. I can't believe they paid me to do it.
That's right.
I just sit at my desk and I just think about what could happen, if I did this. And I mean, yeah, totally right. That's the idealized.
That's sarcasm. Case.
That's the idealized version, right? I think the truth is like you also have to be, as a preacher, willing to say like, it's not really about me, and I just hope that I get out of the way enough that what's being portrayed or proclaimed in the gospel can come through in a real meaningful way. And
yeah, totally.
So, that's all to say that this worship series really is about how do we find those spiritual experiences in our own lives. And I think that worship plays a really important role, not only in the preaching, but also in like the singing and the partaking of sacrament and the prayer. And so I think we are trying to cultivate that. The challenge that exists, like this past Sunday, is a good example. Is that like what happens when things go awry, kind of falter, and the wheels feel like they're coming off, right?
So if you're just joining and you've never listened to us before, so last week is the first week we went back in person after a year, more than a year of being all virtual. Yeah. So now we're juggling this in-person first service and then moving and doing still our virtual service at 10:20, 10:25, whatever, with our Sunday sit down and then the worship service. So, the kind of reality is we've not quite doubled the work, but like it's definitely picked up. And so, yeah, now we're trying to make sure we provide two really beneficial, effective, like, I don't even know the right word, like experiential, right? Like here we're talking about this in Divine Encounter, like these experiences that are high quality in this space for these two different things. Okay, so with that said, with that background laid, we start our virtual worship service yesterday, and we make it to the Sunday sit down. We have this little break between the Sunday sit down and then worship, and then nothing audio worked. So I went back this morning. I looked at it. It was 4 minutes of dead silence, which feels like an eternity in the virtual space, right?
So yes.
But props to Dexter. Dexter's behind the scenes right now. Started going down the checklist, right? He's like, it shows like everything should be working, starts going through all the things, and within 4 minutes, really, it's pretty remarkable that he was able to figure out what it was. And just one box had to be reset, like. So that was how the virtual worship service started off.
Yeah, I think what's so unsettling about it is we were encouraged by other folks, the leadership team in particular, to be like, it's really good that we're going to do these two worship services, but make sure that like the quality at 10:50 doesn't like drop off. And then like
this happens.
4 minutes of silence. Oh, hashtag good news.
Hashtag
that in and of itself would have been enough for us on Sunday. But then
are you ready?
But then I am walking through an offertory shot.
So if you're joining on the podcast and not live with us or not watching this on our YouTube channel, we're showing.
Yeah.
So walk us through what's happening, Mitchell.
Yeah. Well, Dexter was very clear. Hey, don't walk through the middle of.
Hold on. This is the spot right here. This is where it hits him. I know. There.
So what's happening here is we have an offertory that Farron was beautifully playing, and to kind of help us set the mood in the worship service, we went to this shot of the stained glass and the beautiful altar display that Rebecca made. And then I was over functioning and I was going to go move a stool, I think, and
Yep.
just totally forgot and knew once that I'd stepped right into the camera, I instantly knew. And then I saw Dexter waving his arms at me. And then I thought, I'm going to finish. I'm going to go get that stool. And so this is what happened.
I wish it wasn't as blurry because the shot is just amazing. Like you can tell by the look on your face, like I know exactly what I did right here, and it's just golden. All I have to say, worship happened.
Still happened, right?
Worship still happened, and our service extended for an extra 4 minutes. So everybody who wanted our worship services to be longer, which I'm sure is everybody, right? Because why would you ever want those to end?
Right.
It's just funny.
Yeah, and yet, like, we trust that we trusted that something really good happened, in the midst of all that. And I think that's what we really see with this series is that, like, we aren't ultimately in control of where the risen Christ is going to show up, right? Like in the text for Sunday, like Mary doesn't even recognize Christ when Christ is being like, why are you crying, Mary? Like, I think it is so hard for us to experience the risen Christ that we can fall victim to this idea that to do so, everything has to be like perfectly aligned, right?
Absolutely.
We overproduce worship and we spend 40 hours on a sermon and everyone who steps up to a microphone is rehearsed 4 times and we pay for choir members and we have the best band possible because we're willing to essentially go buy that, and we put everything in place, and yet Christ doesn't show up in our midst when we've aligned everything perfectly. Now, that is not to say that we should not strive after excellence in worship, right?
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take it seriously. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't write good sermons or practice our music or, hire folks to help us experience worship better, right? But it does say that those things are not necessary for the risen Christ to show up in our midst. And in fact, if we get so focused on everything being rightly aligned, chances are we'll miss the risen Christ because the risen Christ shows up like a dirty gardener most of the time.
Absolutely. And this made me think of, like, when you're talking about this, you remember Simon, was it Simon Magus? I don't remember his name. In Acts 8, where he was known to be like this kind of magician person, and he sees this, like the disciples doing these works of God and like these miraculous works, and he basically wants to figure out how to like buy it, right? He offered money. Right. He says, it's in 8:19, give me also this power so that anyone on whom I lay my hands may receive the Holy Spirit, right? Like, that's the perfect explanation of what you just said, right? We could spend as much money there is in the world to try to make sure everything was perfect in whatever we're creating, and it still turns out that Jesus shows up like a dirty gardener.
Yeah.
Like, that's the good news of the gospel right there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we're attempting to say and say to ourselves as much as anyone else, right, is that, like, these encounters have profound impact on how we understand our identity as Christians, right? It is not about right belief or perfect belief or striving after a purity in our orthodoxy. It is about these experiences that we desperately need to help us recenter and re-engage with the gospel. And so I'm excited about this worship series because I need it. And I think it's a good word for us as we start gathering back in person. Like, it's going to be awkward. We haven't seen really anyone in like a year. It's going to be awkward. Can we fist bump in the parking lot? Can we not? What does it mean when someone gets a little too close? How are we going to deal with that? And so we're kind of working it out and outside, right? But we'll still have to do this as we transition towards being in person. And I think that reality is just, it's going to be messy and confusing and kind of awkward. And we still expect Christ to show up in that as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good word. Tell me if this is just me or if you experienced the same thing. The last 2 weeks, I was so tired after I got home from church. And it's a longer morning, right? But I really think that
waking up at Easter, we were like,
yes,
call time was early.
Totally.
Right.
But I mean, call time of 7 yesterday, like that's early, but not like stupid early, right? And yet when I got home yesterday, I was so tired. And I don't know if it's just because my body's not used to being in person with people and this like interaction, and now it's taking more out of me to be back in physical spaces again. I don't know, but it's really an interesting to pay attention to my body in the midst of all that and how it's going to take adjusting and, you know, all these things to get back to some semblance of whatever normal looks like, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good word. And the truth is like grace abounds and all of that. And
yeah, right.
We're, you know, and there's responsibility for us to take it seriously, right? Like we can't expect to have these encounters with the risen Christ unless we're like showing up.
Yeah, that's right.
You know what I mean? And that doesn't mean like in person, like showing up in person. It just means that like if we're not showing up fully, even if we are tired or anxious or whatever, right? We're not showing up as ourselves in the spaces where the community is gathering, then we can't expect to have these encounters with the risen Christ, because the only thing that was really required of Mary, it wasn't that she needed to stop crying. She clearly didn't need to have the ability to understand,
right?
Right. All she needed really to do was show up, and that's the good news for us, is that like by showing up, we have this opportunity.
That's a good word. That's a good word.
So next week's Doubting Thomas.
Love him. Patron saint of deconstruction.
Yeah, totally right. And the following week is Jesus eating like the worst. It sounds like the worst breakfast ever on a beach.
Whatever. I think that Sunday we should have a fish fry in the parking lot.
Okay, dude. It's not like Jesus is frying fish down there.
Well, you don't know that. He could have had a little fire going on and roast
over a charcoal little fire. It's like grilled fish and bread for breakfast. Give me a break. That's not.
I'm in. Let's do it. And then on Pentecost, we're gonna have a shrimp boil or like a crawfish boil.
That would be awesome. We should have a big outdoor Pentecost gumbo, something.
Totally. I think it'd be. I'm a fan. Sushi and rice. Exactly, Dexter. Thank you. See, Dexter gets it.
No.
Nah, man, I'm not about that for breakfast.
Nah. So Jesus out on the beach, we in that series, and we're going to start a new series on the Holy Spirit, and it's going to hopefully propel us into this great spiritual space where we can like keep moving forward. Because, as I said in my sermon, things are kind of opening up. We didn't even get to talk about inaugurated eschatology today.
Oh man, that's a whole. Should we do a Tiny Desk series on eschatologies?
Oh, dude, that's my jam right there. I'm not much for atonement, but I love a good
eschatology
discussion.
We could sit around and read Left Behind for a while, and
just kidding. Says social stamina is weak right now, no doubt.
Totally.
Doubt. Thank you all for making to the end of this podcast.
I'll make the invitation here. We talked about it at the Sunday sit down, but I'll reiterate it here. Right, like if you have had a religious experience or a spiritual experience or an encounter with the risen Christ, we'd love to hear it. So you can email me, pdickey, D-I-E-K-E, pdickey at wrumc.org or office at wrumc.org. You can email it there too. You can DM us on social media. We'll get the message there. I would love to just hear your story. And, if you're willing, maybe we'll find a way to share it as well. But if you're not willing, totally get that too. But we'd love to know what your experiences are.
Absolutely. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Totally. Do you want to play the thing one more time? No, you good?
Oh, on the way out. There it is. See you next week. Bye.
Wait, next week? Next week? What? Next week.